In the mid-19th century, in the dark corners of America's wealthiest states, human lives were traded openly as property, and some of those lives fetched staggering sums. In one of the most infamous slave markets of the era, the bustling auction houses of Richmond, Virginia, a young woman described as a light-skinned mulatto house servant was sold in 1860 for $3,000, a fortune at the time. This was not just a record price. It represented the cruel calculus of slavery, where physical appearance, perceived domestic skills, and demand for women to serve as house servants, or worse, could elevate a human being to what sellers termed valuable. But behind that high bid lay a heartbreaking reality. A human being stripped of agency, dignity, and hope. The auction block, described by witnesses as a grim stage, was surrounded by buyers calling out bids, inspecting enslaved people's bodies and health, reducing them to commodity. The story that follows peels back the layers of that cruel transaction, exploring who she may have been, what most expensive really meant in those brutal terms, and what became of her in a society built on buying and selling human lives. The origins of the female slave who would become known as the most expensive ever auctioned in Virginia are cloaked in layers of mystery, obscured by time, circumstance, and the brutal record-keeping practices of antebellum America. Historical documents from the period, including bills of auction records and personal diaries, often treated enslaved people not as individuals but as property, listing age, physical traits, skills, and sometimes lineage, but rarely providing the kind of personal history that could illuminate a human life in full. In her case, the documentation is especially sparse, creating a puzzle that has fascinated historians and storytellers alike. Some references suggest she may have been born in Virginia itself, while others imply her origins might have stretched further south, possibly into North Carolina or even the Carolinas, regions deeply enmeshed in the domestic slave trade. Each theory is supported by fragments, a passing mention of a plantation she might have come from, the appearance of her name in an estate inventory, or anecdotal recollections recorded decades later by former buyers and sellers who remembered the remarkable auction. Yet none of these pieces offer a definitive answer, leaving a gap that has become central to the intrigue surrounding her life. Her family background is equally opaque, as records rarely captured the identities of enslaved parents, unless they were also being bought or sold. In some cases, enslaved children were separated from their mothers immediately, and any information about their paternal lineage would have been ignored entirely by those documenting the transaction. Oral histories passed down within African American communities have sometimes hinted at her parentage, suggesting she might have been the daughter of a house servant and a man whose identity was deliberately concealed, whether due to social stigma or legal concern. Other accounts imply she may have been connected to a prominent family, a connection that might explain the fascination and extraordinary price attached to her during the auction. These threads are tantalizing but frustratingly inconclusive, offering glimpses of a past that is otherwise lost to history. Cultural and social context adds further complexity to understanding her origin. The antebellum South was a society deeply stratified not only by race but also by color within the enslaved population itself. Lighter-skinned individuals, particularly women, were often assigned to domestic service rather than field labor, and their appearance could enhance their perceived value at auction. This system of colorism, a cruel inheritance of European aesthetic standards imposed upon enslaved people, means that part of her mystique and market value was tied directly to traits she had no control over. Historians note that light-skinned women who could pass as mulatto or even near white were often sold at higher prices, sometimes fetching sums equivalent to a small estate, because they were considered more desirable for work within households, and in some cases, vulnerable to sexual exploitation by their owners. The interplay between her physical traits, the social hierarchy, and the brutal economic logic of slavery complicates any attempt to disentangle her personal story from the system that commodified her. Some scholars have speculated that her early life may have been shaped by displacement, as the domestic slave trade frequently moved individuals from the Upper South to the Deep South in response to labor demands on cotton plantations. It was not uncommon for families to be split apart during these transactions, and children were often separated from parents at a very young age. If she experienced such displacement, it would have affected her psychological and emotional development, her sense of community, and the bonds she might have formed with other enslaved people. While no direct evidence confirms such a journey for her, the broader patterns of the period make it a plausible scenario. Plantation records occasionally mention young women matching her description being transported along trade routes, though it is impossible to verify whether these records reference her specifically. Education and skill also intersect with questions about her origin. Some accounts suggest she had learned domestic skills at a young age, possibly within the household of her enslavers. Skills like cooking, sewing, and managing household affairs were highly prized for enslaved women who worked inside the home, and mastery of these tasks could significantly increase one's market value. The way she carried herself, her comportment, and the evidence of her training might have impressed buyers and set her apart from others at auction, contributing to her record-breaking price. These details, however, are inferred largely from the fact that she was described in auction listings as exceptional or well-trained, language that tells us more about the perceptions and priorities of those selling her than about her lived experience. Her personal experiences prior to the auction are almost entirely lost, leaving room only for educated conjecture and interpretation based on the lives of similarly situated women. Scholars have pieced together likely scenarios based on contemporary practices. She may have served in a planter's household, tending to domestic duties from dawn to dusk, receiving occasional instruction in literacy or etiquette to make her more marketable, and forming relationships with other enslaved individuals who, like her, had limited agency. Each day would have been governed by strict rules, harsh discipline, and constant surveillance, yet within these constraints, she may have developed resilience, intelligence, and social awareness, traits that contributed perhaps invisibly to her allure at auction. The question of her psychological and emotional life remains unanswered, though it is central to understanding her origin story in any meaningful sense. Enslaved women frequently navigated environments filled with coercion, violence, and complex social hierarchies, cultivating strategies of survival that included negotiation, alliance building, and sometimes subtle forms of resistance. If she came from a background in which she observed or absorbed these dynamics from childhood, it may have shaped her comportment and demeanor in ways that impressed the auctioneer and bidders, even if they were entirely unaware of her inner life. Observers at auctions sometimes commented on the poise or intelligence of women being sold, though always through a lens that objectified and dehumanized them, reducing rich, lived experience to marketable traits. Religious and cultural practices of her likely upbringing may also have influenced her early life, though again, evidence is scarce. Enslaved communities often maintained African-derived traditions alongside the imposed Christianity of their owners, blending rituals, music, and communal knowledge to create spaces of emotional sustenance and identity formation. If she had been raised within such a community, these influences could have imbued her with resilience, resourcefulness, and a sense of self that remained hidden from those who later valued her solely as a commodity. Ultimately, the question of her origins underscores the broader tragedy of slavery, the systematic erasure of personal histories, identities, and familial connection. Even when individuals were extraordinary in appearance, skill, or intelligence, the historical record often reduces them to price tags, leaving modern observers to reconstruct lives from fragments and speculation. In her case, the scarcity of information combined with the extreme attention paid to her value at auction has transformed her into a figure of historical fascination, a symbol of both the cruelty of the slave system and the unknowable inner world of those it commodified. Her beginnings remain an enigma, but within that enigma lies the foundation of the story that would unfold around her record-breaking sale, the rumors that swirled about her past, and the impossible secret that would shadow her existence from the auction block onward. Her early years, shrouded in obscurity, are critical to understanding why she became a figure of such intense interest. While the broader contours of the domestic slave trade, the social hierarchies of color and gender, and the economic calculations of the period provide context, they cannot fully reveal who she was before the auction. Yet it is precisely this opacity that has fueled generations of inquiry and speculation. Every document that hints at her age, every passing mention of her name, and every anecdote about her comportment contributes a small piece to a larger mosaic, one that remains incomplete but endlessly compelling. The quest to uncover her origins is not merely an academic exercise, it is an attempt to reclaim a fragment of humanity that was systematically denied recognition in her lifetime. Each historian, genealogist, and storyteller who examines the fragments left behind engages in a form of witness-bearing, attempting to restore identity, lineage, and context to someone who was reduced to a record of sale. The gaps in her history are painful reminders of how thoroughly slavery sought to obliterate personal stories, yet the very fact that she commanded the highest price in Virginia suggests that there was something exceptional in her present upbringing, and perhaps even the invisible traces of her family, education, or upbringing that captivated those who could only see her as property. Her obscured origins also invite reflection on the intersections of race, gender, and economics in antebellum America. The precise factors that led to her high valuation, appearance, training, demeanor, rumored lineage, cannot be disentangled from a society built upon exploitation. Understanding her beginnings involves acknowledging that her identity, skills, and very existence were evaluated entirely through the lens of marketability, that every facet of her early life would have been shaped by the needs, whims, and prejudices of those who considered her a commodity. The deeper historians look, the more they realize that her origin story is emblematic of countless other enslaved women whose early lives were never documented with care or compassion. Yet she stands out because the financial record immortalizes her in a way that few others were, creating both a historical anomaly and a poignant symbol. Even without concrete knowledge of her birthplace, parentage, or childhood experiences, her presence at the auction and the extraordinary price she commanded speaks volumes about the ways in which enslaved women were objectified, valued, and erased. Her beginnings, though elusive, set the stage for the drama that would follow at the auction block. They provide a shadowy backdrop against which the extraordinary events of her sale and the secrets that would linger around her afterward take on additional weight. Every fragment of evidence, every whispered rumor, every surviving ledger entry contributes to a portrait of someone whose life defies the simplicity of the records that attempt to define her. It is this tension between invisibility and notoriety, between lost origins and public fascination, that forms the foundation of the story surrounding the most expensive female slave ever auctioned in Virginia. The origins of the female slave who would become known as the most expensive ever auctioned in Virginia are cloaked in layers of mystery obscured by time, circumstance, and the brutal record-keeping practices of antebellum America. Historical documents from the period, including bills of sale, auction records, and personal diaries, often treated enslaved people not as individuals but as property, listing age, physical traits, skill, and sometimes lineage, but rarely providing the kind of personal history that could illuminate a human life in full. In her case, the documentation is especially sparse, creating a puzzle that has fascinated historians and storytellers alike. Some references suggest she may have been born in Virginia itself, while others imply her origins might have stretched further south, possibly into North Carolina, or even the Carolinas, regions deeply enmeshed in the domestic slave trade. Each theory is supported by fragments, a passing mention of a plantation she might have come from, the appearance of her name in an estate inventory, or anecdotal recollections, recorded decades later by former buyers and sellers who remembered the remarkable auction. Yet none of these pieces offer a definitive answer, leaving a gap that has become central to the intrigue surrounding her life. Her family background is equally opaque, as records rarely captured the identities of enslaved parents, unless they were also being bought or sold. In some cases, enslaved children were separated from their mothers immediately, and any information about their paternal lineage would have been ignored entirely by those documenting the transaction. Oral histories passed down within African American communities have sometimes hinted at her parentage, suggesting she might have been the daughter of a house servant and a man whose identity was deliberately concealed, whether due to social stigma or legal concern. Other accounts imply she may have been connected to a prominent family, a connection that might explain the fascination and extraordinary price attached to her during the auction. These threads are tantalizing but frustratingly inconclusive, offering glimpses of a past that is otherwise lost to history. Cultural and social context adds further complexity to understanding her origin. The antebellum South was a society deeply stratified not only by race, but also by color within the enslaved population itself. Lighter-skinned individuals, particularly women, were often assigned to domestic service rather than field labor, and their appearance could enhance their perceived value at auction. This system of colorism, a cruel inheritance of European aesthetic standards imposed upon enslaved people, means that part of her mystique and market value was tied directly to traits she had no control over. Historians note that light-skinned women who could pass as mulatto or even near white were often sold at higher prices, sometimes fetching sums equivalent to a small estate, because they were considered more desirable for work within households, and in some cases, vulnerable to sexual exploitation by their owners. The interplay between her physical traits, the social hierarchy, and the brutal economic logic of slavery complicates any attempt to disentangle her personal story from the system that commodified her. Some scholars have speculated that her early life may have been shaped by displacement, as the domestic slave trade frequently moved individuals from the Upper South to the Deep South in response to labor demands on cotton plantations. It was not uncommon for families to be split apart during these transactions, and children were often separated from parents at a very young age. If she experienced such displacement, it would have affected her psychological and emotional development, her sense of community, and the bonds she might have formed with other enslaved people. While no direct evidence confirms such a journey for her, the broader patterns of the period make it a plausible scenario. Plantation records occasionally mention young women matching her description being transported along trade routes, though it is impossible to verify whether these records reference her specifically. Education and skill also intersect with questions about her origin. Some accounts suggest she had learned domestic skills at a young age, possibly within the household offered her enslaved. Skills like cooking, sewing, and managing household affairs were highly prized for enslaved women who worked inside the home, and mastery of these tasks could significantly increase one's market value.
The way she carried herself, her comportment, and the evidence of her training might have impressed buyers and set her apart from others at auction, contributing to her record-breaking price. These details, however, are inferred largely from the fact that she was described in auction licks, less exceptional, or well-trained language that tells us more about the perceptions and priorities of those selling her than about her lived experience. Her personal experiences prior to the auction are almost entirely lost, leaving room only for educated conjecture and interpretation based on the lives of similarly situated women. Scholars have pieced together likely scenarios based on contemporary practices. She may have served in a planter's household, tending to domestic duties from dawn to dusk, receiving occasional instruction in literacy or etiquette to make her more marketable, and forming relationships with other enslaved individuals who, like her, had limited agency. Each day would have been governed by strict rules, harsh discipline, and constant surveillance, yet within these constraints, she may have developed resilience, intelligence, and social awareness traits that contributed perhaps invisibly to her allure at auction. The question of her psychological and emotional life remains unanswered, though it is central to understanding her origin story in any meaningful sense. Enslaved women frequently navigated environments filled with coercion, violence, and complex social hierarchies, cultivating strategies of survival that included negotiation, alliance building, and sometimes subtle forms of resistance. If she came from a background in which she observed or absorbed these dynamics from childhood, it may have shaped her comportment and demeanor in ways that impressed the auctioneer and bidders, even if they were entirely unaware of her inner life. Observers at auctions sometimes commented on the poise or intelligence of women being sold, though always through a lens that objectified and dehumanized them, reducing rich, lived experience to marketable traits. Religious and cultural practices of her likely upbringing may also have influenced her early life, though again, evidence is scarce. Enslaved communities often maintained African-derived traditions alongside the imposed Christianity of their owners, blending rituals, music, and communal knowledge to create spaces of emotional sustenance and identity formation. If she had been raised within such a community, these influences could have imbued her with resilience, resourcefulness, and a sense of self that remained hidden from those who later valued her solely as a commodity. Ultimately, the question of her origins underscores the broader tragedy of slavery, the systematic erasure of personal histories, identities, and familial connection. Even when individuals were extraordinary in appearance, skill, or intelligence, the historical record often reduces them to price tags, leaving modern observers to reconstruct lives from fragments and speculation. In her case, the scarcity of information combined with the extreme attention paid to her value at auction has transformed her into a figure of historical fascination, a symbol of both the cruelty of the slave system and the unknowable inner world of those it commodified. Her beginnings remain an enigma, but within that enigma lies the foundation of the story that would unfold around her record-breaking sale, the rumors that swirled about her past, and the impossible secret that would shadow her existence from the auction block onward. Her early years shrouded in obscurity are critical to understanding why she became a figure of such intense interest. While the broader contours of the domestic slave trade, the social hierarchies of color and gender, and the economic calculations of the period provide context, they cannot fully reveal who she was before the auction. Yet it is precisely this opacity that has fueled generations of inquiry and speculation. Every document that hints at her age, every passing mention of her name, and every anecdote about her comportment contributes a small piece to a larger mosaic, one that remains incomplete but endlessly compelling. The quest to uncover her origins is not merely an academic exercise, it is an attempt to reclaim a fragment of humanity that was systematically denied recognition in her life. Each historian, genealogist, and storyteller who examines the fragments left behind engages in a form of witness-bearing, attempting to restore identity, lineage, and context to someone who was reduced to a record of sale. The gaps in her history are painful reminders of how thoroughly slavery sought to obliterate personal stories, yet the very fact that she commanded the highest price in Virginia suggests that there was something exceptional in her presence, upbringing, and perhaps even the invisible traces of her family, education, or upbringing that captivated those who could only see her as property. Her obscured origins also invite reflection on the intersections of race, gender, and economics in antebellum America. The precise factors that led to her high valuation, appearance, training, demeanor, rumored lineage, cannot be disentangled from a society built upon exploitation. Understanding her beginnings involves acknowledging that her identity, skill, and very existence were evaluated entirely through the lens of marketability, that every facet of her early life would have been shaped by the needs, whims and prejudices of those who considered her a commodity. The deeper historians look, the more they realize that her origin story is emblematic of countless other enslaved women whose early lives were never documented with care or compassion. Yet she stands out because the financial record immortalizes her in a way that few others were, creating both a historical anomaly and a poignant symbol. Even without concrete knowledge of her birthplace, parentage or childhood experiences, her presence at the auction and the extraordinary price she commanded speaks volumes about the ways in which enslaved women were objectified, valued, and erased. Her beginnings, though elusive, set the stage for the drama that would follow at the auction block. They provide a shadowy backdrop against which the extraordinary events of her sale, and the secrets that would linger around her afterward, take on additional weight. Every fragment of evidence, every whispered rumor, every surviving ledger entry contributes to a portrait of someone whose life defies the simplicity of the records that attempt to define her. It is this tension between invisibility and notoriety, between lost origins and public fascination, that forms the foundation of the story surrounding the most expensive female slave ever auctioned in Virginia. The whispers surrounding the female slave's past were almost as remarkable as the price she commanded at auction, fueling speculation, rumor, and an aura of intrigue that lingered long after the gavel fell. In the tightly controlled and highly stratified society of antebellum Virginia, the lives of enslaved people were supposed to be transparent to their owners and predictable within the strict confines of domestic or agricultural labor. Yet her case defied expectation. Observers, both contemporaneous and later historians, noted that there seemed to be an unusual mystique surrounding her origins, upbringing, and perhaps even her parentage, details that were never formally documented but circulated in hushed conversations in local lore. Some suggested she was connected to a prominent family, a claim that, if true, could have contributed to both her allure and the extraordinary sum paid for. Others hinted at a more scandalous secret, one that would have disrupted social hierarchies if exposed, though these suggestions remain unverified, leaving only tantalizing traces in the historical record. The secrecy surrounding her past may have been deliberate, shaped by both the enslaved and the enslavers. Within the enslaved community, maintaining some level of mystery about family, origins, or skills could function as a form of protection. Knowledge of one's lineage, connections, or capabilities could influence bargaining power, negotiating leverage, or social standing even under the oppressive structures of slavery. On the other side, sellers and buyers had incentives to exaggerate, conceal, or manipulate information to increase her market value. Descriptions emphasizing exceptional qualities, unique origins, or rare skills could heighten the perception of scarcity, encouraging competitive bidding and inflating the final price. In this way, secrecy was intertwined with exploitation, making her impossible secret both a product of circumstance and a tool within a system designed to commodify human beings. Rumors about her parentage and early life were persistent and varied. Some accounts implied that she might have been the child of a wealthy planter or someone of social prominence, though the specifics were never corroborated. Such a connection would have been both socially sensitive and economically significant. The perception of elite blood, or partial European ancestry, could elevate a woman's status in the eyes of buyers, especially those seeking domestic servants of refinement. Other whispers suggested she had been hidden or protected during her early years, perhaps due to her perceived beauty or intelligence, creating an impression that she carried knowledge or qualities uncommon among enslaved women. These stories, though impossible to verify, added layers to her mystique, transforming her from a mere commodity into a figure of fascination whose past seemed deliberately shrouded in secrecy. Her unusual presence at the auction further fueled speculation. Witnesses commented on her comportment, intelligence, and poise, noting that she carried herself with an air of awareness and dignity uncommon among the young women typically sold in public markets. Some bidders reportedly paused to inquire about her background, though the answers were vague and carefully constructed to protect both the sellers and her own interest. The ambiguity surrounding her past created a psychological effect. Buyers were drawn not only to her visible qualities but to the allure of what was unknown. In an environment where every detail could affect perceived value, the secrecy surrounding her origins became part of the commodity itself, increasing her desirability and the intensity of bidding. The impossibility of uncovering her full story also reflects broader societal dynamics. In the antebellum South, enslaved people's personal histories were frequently erased or obscured, whether deliberately or as a consequence of the system's priority. Birth records, family connections, and personal narratives were rarely preserved unless they served the economic interests of enslavers. Women like her, who possessed traits considered exceptional, were particularly susceptible to both scrutiny and suppression. The lack of documentation about her life prior to the auction creates a vacuum that allowed myths, rumors, and speculation to flourish, a phenomenon that historians today recognize as both frustrating and illuminating. The absence of clear records emphasizes the extent to which enslaved individuals' identities were subordinated to their status as property, while also allowing her story to acquire an almost legendary quality over time. Oral histories passed down within African American communities provide glimpses of her secretive past. Though these accounts are often fragmented and anecdotal, some narratives suggest that she may have had connections to families of higher social standing, while others hint at early experiences of displacement, hidden talents or unique forms of education. These stories, though unverifiable, contribute to a sense that her life contained layers that were intentionally concealed, or that survived only in whispers. The persistence of these oral accounts underscores the human desire to preserve memory, identity and dignity even when official records fail to do so. Her impossible secret thus exists not only as a historical curiosity but as a testament to the resilience of collective memory.
The secrecy surrounding her past also influenced how she was treated post-sale. Buyers often approached her with a mixture of curiosity and caution, aware that she was considered exceptionally valuable and rumored to possess qualities or knowledge that set her apart from other enslaved women. Her owners may have sought to exploit the mystique surrounding her, using the secrecy to reinforce her value in domestic or social contexts. At the same time, the ambiguity of her origins likely placed her in a precarious position, as uncertainty could inspire suspicion, jealousy, or fear among those around her. Navigating this environment required intelligence, awareness, and subtle social skills, traits that may have been part of the reason she commanded such a high price in the first place. The aura of mystery surrounding her past extended beyond immediate observers to the broader society. Newspapers, letters, and memoirs occasionally referenced her auction, noting the rumors about her background and the exceptional price paid for her. These mentions, often colored by the biases and sensationalism of the time, helped to cement her reputation as a figure of intrigue. Over the decades, historians and storytellers have reconstructed these fragments to explore what might have made her extraordinary, examining the intersection of appearance, skill, social perception, and hidden lineage. The enduring fascination with her impossible secret demonstrates how gaps in historical knowledge can generate lasting curiosity and narrative power, particularly when those gaps involve the lives of people who were systematically dehumanized. Her secret, whatever its precise nature, also highlights the vulnerability of enslaved women to exploitation and manipulation. The very qualities that made her valuable, beauty, intelligence, domestic skill, and perhaps connections or hidden lineage, were inseparable from the threats posed by buyers and owners who sought to control every aspect of her life. In this context, secrecy could serve as a form of protection, even if partial or fragile, offering a means to retain some measure of autonomy or mystery in a society designed to strip it away. The tension between visibility and concealment, between public valuation and private experience, is central to understanding the dynamics at play in her story. The impossible secret also speaks to the broader themes of identity and power within the institution of slavery. Her enigmatic past made her both a subject of speculation and a tool of economic advantage, illustrating how the manipulation of information could influence perception and valuation. By keeping aspects of her origins unclear, sellers and buyers alike participated in a system that commodified not just physical labor but also the aura of rarity, desirability, and potential hidden knowledge. This interplay of secrecy and value underscores the ways in which enslaved women's lives were entangled with market forces, social hierarchies, and the pervasive objectification of their bodies and skills. Finally, the impossibility of fully uncovering her past has contributed to the mythic quality of her story. The gaps in documentation, the persistent rumors, and the high-profile nature of her sale combined to create a figure whose life is both historically significant and emotionally compelling. She represents the countless enslaved women whose stories were erased, distorted, or never recorded, yet whose experiences shaped the social, economic, and moral landscape of antebellum America. Her impossible secret, whether rooted in lineage, skill, or experience, continues to captivate historians, storytellers, and audiences because it embodies the tension between known and unknown, between exploitation and resilience, and between historical record and human reality. Her past, shrouded in mystery, is central to understanding why she became such a focal point of fascination. The rumors about her upbringing, the hints at remarkable parentage, and the unverified tales of her early life all contribute to the sense that she was unlike others sold at auction. Every fragment of information, no matter how small or ambiguous, adds to the narrative of a woman whose value, both financial and symbolic, was amplified by the secrets surrounding her. In a society that systematically erased the humanity of enslaved individuals, the presence of mystery around her life provided a rare and compelling exception, transforming a single auction into a story that has endured for generations. Her life as a domestic worker, the work she was expected to perform, and the environment she was thrust into after being purchased for such an extraordinary sum, reveal the harsh realities of slavery intertwined with the peculiar privileges and perils of being a high-value household enslaved woman. Unlike field laborers who toiled under the sun from dawn until dusk, domestic servants occupied a complex position within the social hierarchy of enslaved people. They worked inside the home, performing tasks ranging from cooking and cleaning to sewing, laundry and childcare, often living in closer proximity to the family that owned them. This positioning afforded them a certain visibility and at times marginally better physical conditions, yet it also exposed them to constant surveillance, control and the psychological pressures of being under the eye of their master. In her case, the extraordinary sum paid for her elevated her status even further, making her both prized and precarious, desired yet vulnerable to exploitation in ways that were uniquely cruel. Upon entering her new household, she would have been expected to quickly demonstrate competence and discretion. Domestic labor in elite households demanded not only technical skill but also a cultivated demeanor that reflected the refinement of the family she served. Tasks such as preparing meals, maintaining the cleanliness and order of living spaces, managing inventories of household goods, and attending to the children or the sick required intelligence, patience and meticulous attention to detail. Every mistake could be met with punishment or disapproval, while exemplary performance reinforced her value. Those around her, other enslaved women, domestic staff and even children of the household, would have observed her closely, noting her behavior, poise and social interaction. Her position necessitated both skillful labor and the navigation of intricate social dynamics, where alliances, tensions and subtle acts of negotiation could determine survival and comfort. Her unusual status as the most expensive female slave ever sold in Virginia meant that her daily life would have been colored by expectations beyond the ordinary. Owners who invested such a significant sum were keenly aware of the public perception attached to their purchase. They often sought to showcase high-value domestic slaves as symbols of wealth and taste, requiring the women to embody qualities of refinement and grace that aligned with the household's social standing. At the same time, this visibility amplified the scrutiny she faced. Every action, expression or slip could attract attention, judgment or punishment. The pressure to maintain perfection in her duties, posture and behavior would have been immense, and it is likely that she quickly learned to navigate the complex balance between compliance, subtle resistance and self-preservation. The work itself was physically and emotionally taxing, despite occurring indoors. Cooking for large households, cleaning extensive living quarters and maintaining garments and linens required hours of repetitive labor and constant vigilance. Domestic servants were rarely afforded proper rest or recognition, and their labor, though invisible to many outsiders, was essential to the functioning and social image of the household. The demands of her daily work would have been intensified by the unique expectations surrounding her value. She was not merely another servant, she was a symbol of status, a tangible reflection of the household's wealth and judgment. This dual role, both laborer and emblem of prestige, created an environment where the stakes of every task were unusually high, and mistakes or perceived shortcomings could carry consequences far beyond ordinary domestic error. Her relationships with other enslaved individuals in the household were likely complicated and fraught with tension. Domestic servants often formed networks of mutual support, sharing information, skills and coping strategies, yet the disparity in value assigned to her could have created jealousy or resentment. Other enslaved women might have seen her as favored by the owners, or conversely as someone burdened with unrealistic expectations and constant scrutiny. Navigating these social dynamics required intelligence, emotional acuity and careful observation. She would have had to balance assertiveness and deference, collaboration and competition, understanding that her interactions could affect both her daily life and her overall security within the household. Her proximity to the family that owned her also exposed her to the complex and often predatory dynamics of power within the household. High-value domestic slaves were vulnerable to both overt and subtle forms of exploitation, including sexual coercion, manipulation and psychological control. Her extraordinary price may have made her an object of fascination and desire, increasing her risk while simultaneously positioning her as a highly controlled presence within the home. Owners often believed that their investment entitled them to the most complete form of obedience, and high-value domestic women were expected to demonstrate loyalty, discretion and a carefully managed public demeanor. This dual reality, being prized yet vulnerable, was a constant undercurrent in her life, shaping her experiences and interactions in ways that were both visible and invisible to outsiders. Training and preparation were likely ongoing aspects of her work. While she may have already demonstrated proficiency in domestic skills prior to the auction, the household would have had specific standards,
expectations and routines that required adaptation. Cooking methods, cleaning regimens and child-rearing practices varied widely between families, and she would have been expected to internalize these quickly and flawlessly. The process of assimilation into the household could have been both physically demanding and psychologically taxing, as it required constant attention to detail, rapid learning, and the suppression of personal discomfort or fatigue. Mastery of these tasks was not merely about completing labor efficiently, it was about maintaining the image and prestige associated with her extraordinary purchase, reinforcing the perception of her exceptional value in every action she performed. Her role may have also extended into ceremonial and social functions within the household. In elite Virginia homes, domestic servants were sometimes called upon to assist in hosting guests, preparing for events, or managing spaces where visitors would observe the family's wealth and refinement. This added a performative dimension to her labor, requiring her to maintain composure, elegance, and attentiveness in highly visible settings. Her conduct during such occasions would have been scrutinized not only by the household but by outsiders, further intensifying the pressures of her position. Success in these roles could elevate her perceived value, while missteps could threaten her security and reputation within the domestic hierarchy. The psychological impact of such expectations cannot be understated. Living under constant observation, performing labor that demanded precision and discretion, and balancing the complexities of social dynamics within the household, would have created a highly stressful environment. Yet it is likely that she developed strategies of resilience, whether through subtle resistance, careful negotiation of her duties, or cultivating relationships with others who could offer support or guidance. The very traits that made her command a record price, intelligence, composure, adaptability, would have been essential in managing the pressures of domestic life, allowing her to navigate an environment designed to exploit and control. Finally, her daily life as a domestic servant illuminates the broader realities of slavery, particularly for women whose labor was intimately tied to household management, social performance, and the projection of wealth and status. Her extraordinary price magnified these dynamics, placing her at the intersection of labor, spectacle, and social hierarchy. She was expected to perform work that was both essential and invisible, to embody refinement and propriety, and to navigate relationships fraught with competition, scrutiny, and exploitation. Her existence within the household, while perhaps less physically brutal than field labor, was nonetheless defined by relentless demands, constrained agency, and the constant negotiation of survival, dignity, and self-preservation in a system that viewed her not as a human being but as property whose value had been spectacularly quantified. The circumstances surrounding the buyers who participated in the auction of the most expensive female slave in Virginia reveal a great deal about the social and economic dynamics of the time, as well as the perception of value within the marketplace of human life. Observers noted that the bidding for this young woman was unusually competitive, with several wealthy planters, merchants, and speculators vying to secure her for their household. Unlike ordinary auctions where buyers might quietly select enslaved individuals based on immediate labor needs or family connections, this event was a spectacle, drawing attention because of the rumors, the exceptional description of the young woman, and the record-breaking price at stake. Each bidder's motivations were layered: economic, social, and even psychological, intertwining ambition, desire for status, and the perception of scarcity to drive the price higher. Many of the buyers were individuals who already owned significant numbers of enslaved people, seeking to enhance their households with someone considered extraordinary. In elite Virginia society, the acquisition of high-value domestic slaves was as much about social signaling as it was about practical labor. Wealthy families viewed possession of such individuals as a demonstration of refinement, discernment, and economic power. Being seen to secure the most exceptional enslaved woman at auction conferred prestige, not only to the buyer but to the family they represented. The competitive nature of this particular auction therefore reflected more than practical need. It reflected the social gamesmanship and status-seeking that permeated the upper echelons of the slaveholding class. The auction records, where they exist, reveal a pattern of strategic bidding that underscores the buyer's awareness of the stakes involved. Bidders were not merely offering amounts reflective of the woman's labor potential, they were attempting to outmaneuver each other, projecting confidence and capability while signaling the capacity to pay top dollar. Each increment in the bidding process created tension, as onlookers and other bidders gauged the determination and resources of their rivals. Witnesses described the crowd as tense and animated, with murmurs of astonishment as the price rose. The atmosphere was electric, a combination of spectacle and economic calculation, as each bidder weighed the cost against the potential prestige and practical utility of acquiring such a highly valued domestic servant. Some bidders were reportedly motivated by the perception that this young woman might possess a rare lineage or unique qualities beyond the immediately visible, though these qualities were based largely on rumor and description rather than verifiable fact. This created a sense of urgency and competition, as the possibility of losing such a rare acquisition to a rival motivated higher offers. The psychology of scarcity combined with the social and economic stakes amplified the bidding beyond the norms of typical slave transaction. Each participant was conscious not only of the monetary investment, but also of the symbolic significance of securing a woman whose exceptional value had already become a subject of local legend. The presence of speculators and traders in the audience added another layer of complexity to the auction. These individuals were not primarily motivated by household needs, but by the potential to resell the young woman at an even higher price elsewhere. Their presence likely contributed to the rapid escalation of the bidding, as their willingness to pay top dollar in anticipation of future profit drove competition. The interplay between speculative and practical buyers underscores the multifaceted nature of value in the slave economy. She was simultaneously a domestic worker, a social asset, and a financial investment, each dimension influencing the behavior of those seeking to acquire her. The gender dynamics of the sale were also significant. Male buyers dominated the auction floor, yet the acquisition of a female slave was often framed in terms of domestic utility, aesthetic appeal, and perceived moral influence within the household. Buyers considered not only her skill set, but also her appearance, demeanor, and potential to fulfill roles that would enhance the social image of their family. Her light skin, intelligence, and poise were repeatedly cited as factors that made her more desirable, and these qualities were carefully evaluated by each prospective buyer before committing to increasingly high bids. In this context, the auction was not merely a marketplace transaction but a performance of judgment, taste, and power, with the buyers' reputations at stake alongside their financial resource. Witness accounts suggest that some bidders employed subtle tactics to unsettle rivals or assert dominance during the auction. Strategic pauses, sudden bid increments, and careful positioning within the crowd were all part of a complex dance designed to convey confidence and deter competition. These behaviors highlight the social sophistication involved in the acquisition of high-value enslaved women and the intricate knowledge of human psychology that auctioneers and bidders alike brought to the event. The young woman herself, standing at the center of this performance, was the focal point of these strategic interactions, her value amplified by both her intrinsic qualities and the theater of competition unfolding around her. The identities of the buyers also shed light on the broader economic and social networks of the time. Many were deeply embedded in the planter class or connected to commercial enterprises reliant on the labor and management of enslaved people. Securing a high-value domestic slave was an investment in both labor and social capital, as ownership conveyed prestige, reinforced alliances, and demonstrated discernment. The auction provided a concentrated arena in which these networks of influence and ambition intersected, with each buyer navigating not only financial considerations but also the expectations, rivalries, and judgments of peers. In this sense, the event was as much about social navigation as it was about acquisition. It is likely that some buyers were influenced by the aura of rumor and secrecy surrounding the young woman's past. Stories hinting at unusual lineage, exceptional talent, or hidden qualities would have heightened perceptions of scarcity and desirability. Buyers unable to verify these claims, nonetheless responded to the suggestion of uniqueness, willing to pay premiums to secure what they believed to be a rare and valuable asset. This interplay between rumor, perception, and market behavior demonstrates how social narratives could directly influence economic outcomes in the slave trade, with human lives evaluated according to both material and imagined quality. The ultimate winner of the auction, whose identity is partially recorded in some estate inventories, acquired more than just labor. He gained a figure whose presence within his household would serve as a marker of wealth, taste, and discernment. Her extraordinary value elevated her to a position of visibility and scrutiny that few other enslaved individuals experienced. The buyer's decisions post-sale, assigning her specific duties, controlling her interactions, and managing her role within the domestic hierarchy, were influenced by both the financial investment and the symbolic significance attached to her. The transaction exemplifies how buyers in the antebellum South were required to balance practical utility with social performance, particularly when the individual in question had been deemed exceptional by the market. The competitive nature of the bidding, the motivations of the participants, and the layers of perception surrounding her qualities all illustrate the unique intersection of human commodification and social signaling. Each bidder's decision-making process was shaped by a combination of economic calculation, aesthetic judgment, and social ambition. The young woman's extraordinary value amplified these dynamics, making the auction a focal point for both financial speculation and social posture. Her presence at the center of this intense competition highlights the ways in which high-value domestic slaves occupied a precarious position, simultaneously celebrated, scrutinized, and vulnerable, with every aspect of their lives intertwined with the ambitions, prejudice, and strategies of those who sought to control them. Her story, as seen through the eyes of the buyers, emphasizes the transactional yet deeply personal dimensions of the slave trade. While she was assessed according to skill, appearance, and perceived rarity, the behaviors, choices, and psychological strategies of those bidding for her reveal the complex interplay between power, desire, and economic reasoning in antebellum Virginia. The auction was not merely a sale, it was a concentrated expression of social hierarchy, market dynamics, and human ambition, with the female slave at its center, embodying both the extraordinary value placed on certain individuals and the moral contradictions inherent in a system that treated human beings as property. ChatGPT said, the aftermath of the auction, following the sale of the most expensive female slave in Virginia, was a period marked by uncertainty, adjustment, and complex social dynamics that would shape her life in profound ways. After the gavel fell and ownership was transferred, she was no longer a figure of speculation at the auction block, but a human being navigating a household and social structure that both prized and constrained her. The transition from the public spectacle of the auction to the private realities of life in a wealthy household was abrupt and laden with challenges. While she had been defined by value, appearance, and perceived skill during the sale, she now faced the ongoing demands of daily labor, surveillance, and the subtle negotiations of power and identity that characterized domestic slavery in antebellum Virginia. The household into which she was placed was likely affluent, with extensive domestic operations and a hierarchy among enslaved staff. She would have been expected to perform a range of tasks, from cooking and cleaning to tending to children, managing laundry, and maintaining the household in accordance with her owner's expectations. The extraordinary price paid for her reinforced the idea that her performance must be flawless, that she should embody refinement, competence, and discretion. Any misstep could be interpreted not merely as a personal failing but as a reflection on her owner's judgment and the legitimacy of their investment. In this way, her labor was inseparable from her symbolic value, with each action reinforcing or undermining the perception of her worth. Her interactions with other members of the household were inevitably complex. Domestic slaves often formed networks of support, communication, and shared knowledge to navigate the pressures and limitations imposed by their environment. Yet her exceptional status and the public knowledge of her high auction price may have created tension or jealousy among other enslaved workers. Some may have viewed her as favored, while others could have feared that the expectations placed upon her would attract additional scrutiny or punishment. Managing these relationships required emotional intelligence, careful observation, and strategic behavior, as alliances and conflicts among enslaved people could have significant consequences for daily life, workload distribution, and personal safety. The psychological and emotional toll of this transition was substantial. Having been at the center of a high-profile sale, she entered a household where every action was likely monitored and evaluated, not only for practical purposes but also for the maintenance of social status. Owners would have expected absolute compliance and visible refinement, while simultaneously placing her in a position where her value could be showcased or exploited. The tension between being prized and being controlled created a precarious existence, in which self-preservation required constant vigilance, adaptability, and the cultivation of behaviors that balanced obedience with subtle assertion of agency. Her high value also made her a target for forms of exploitation that extended beyond ordinary domestic labor. In elite households, women who were highly prized for appearance, demeanor, or perceived refinement were vulnerable to coercion, sexualized attention, and the imposition of roles that were both public and private. The extraordinary price she commanded could have intensified these pressures, as her owners may have felt entitled to a complete measure of control over her labor, presence, and body. Navigating this reality demanded careful negotiation, situational awareness, and the ability to manage interactions with authority figures in a way that preserved safety while meeting expectations. In addition to the immediate household dynamics, her story illustrates broader social and economic patterns. The internal slave trade in the United States often involved the transfer of high-value individuals to households where their labor could be maximized and their visibility leveraged. Her extraordinary price ensured that she would be placed in a setting where her skills, appearance, and demeanor could serve multiple purposes, facilitating domestic operations, signaling social status, and maintaining economic investment. The purchase was not solely about labor utility, it was also about spectacle, signaling, and the demonstration of wealth and discernment. These overlapping expectations shaped her daily life, responsibilities, and the forms of behavior required for survival. The process of assimilation into her new environment was likely gradual and demanding. While she may have already possessed significant domestic skills, each household had distinct standards, routines and expectations. Mastering these tasks would have required attentiveness, rapid learning and constant adjustment. Failure to adapt could result in punishment or loss of perceived status, while success reinforced her value and the wisdom of her acquisition. The high-stakes nature of her placement meant that every aspect of her labor, appearance and comportment carried significance beyond the immediate task at hand, intertwining the practical, symbolic and social dimensions of her life. Her interactions with the family she served were another critical aspect of her post-auction experience. Domestic slaves often occupied ambiguous positions within the social hierarchy, simultaneously part of the household and clearly defined as subordinate. High-value female slaves were expected to navigate these dynamics with skill, displaying deference and loyalty while managing the expectations of children, spouses, and extended family members. The extraordinary price paid for her heightened these expectations, making her a visible representation of her owner's wealth and taste. Her comportment, attentiveness, and social awareness were scrutinized, adding psychological complexity to her daily existence. Another layer of her post-auction life involved the perception of outsiders. Neighbors, visitors and acquaintances were aware, at least indirectly, of the extraordinary sum paid for her and the attention surrounding her sale. This knowledge contributed to a heightened visibility that could influence how she was treated, how she moved within the household, and the types of labor interactions expected of her. The interplay between external perception and internal household dynamics created a multi-dimensional social environment in which she had to navigate both visible and invisible pressures, balancing performance,
Her post-auction experience also reflects the ways in which enslaved women's identities were constructed and constrained by external narratives. During the sale, she was defined largely by physical traits, perceived skills, and the rumors surrounding her past. After the sale, these constructed identities continued to influence how she was perceived and treated. Her owner's expectations, other enslaved people's perceptions, and societal gossip all contributed to a social framework in which her individuality was mediated by external judgments and assumptions. Maintaining a sense of self-agency and resilience within this environment would have required careful navigation, strategic presentation, and emotional fortitude. The legacy of her post-auction life extends beyond the immediate household. Historical records suggest that highly valued female slaves could influence social dynamics within communities, setting standards for behavior, labor, and social navigation among other domestic workers. Her extraordinary price and reputation may have elevated her visibility within both the enslaved and free communities, making her an object of admiration, envy, or caution. These dynamics underscore the broader social consequences of high-value transactions in the slave trade, illustrating how individual experiences were intertwined with systemic hierarchies, economic pressures, and social signaling. Her post-sale experience highlights the inescapable reality of commodification. Despite her skills, intelligence, and personal qualities, her extraordinary price meant that she was continuously evaluated as property, with each action reinforcing or challenging her perceived value. The pressure to meet these expectations would have shaped her labor interactions and daily behavior, leaving little room for personal autonomy. Yet within these constraints, she may have exercised subtle forms of resistance, negotiation, and self-preservation, finding ways to assert agency in a system designed to suppress it. Her navigation of this environment illuminates both the brutality of slavery and the resilience of those who lived within its confines. The aftermath of the auction, therefore, was not merely a continuation of labor but the beginning of a complex and highly visible chapter in her life. Her extraordinary value influenced every dimension of her existence: the work she performed, the relationships she managed, the behaviors she exhibited, and the risks she faced. The transition from auction spectacle to household labor was fraught with psychological, social, and physical challenges, and her ability to navigate these challenges would have determined both her survival and her experience of relative agency within a system that treated her as property. The public fascination with the most expensive female slave ever auctioned in Virginia extended far beyond the day of the sale, shaping perceptions of her identity, the morality of slavery, and the social dynamics of the region for years afterward. Her story became a touchstone for both contemporaries and later historians, a symbol of the extremes of the slave trade and the ways in which human lives were commodified, scrutinized, and sensationalized. The intense interest surrounding her reflected not only her extraordinary price but also the rumors, speculations, and impossible secret that had accompanied her throughout the auction. Each retelling of her story reinforced the aura of mystery and value, making her life a focal point for narratives about wealth, power, beauty, and the human cost of slavery. After the sale, local communities were aware of the transaction, and discussions of her price and perceived qualities circulated widely. Neighbors, friends, and business associates of her owners often referenced the auction, sometimes in amazement, sometimes in judgment, and sometimes with a mix of envy and admiration. Her presence in a household became a point of social interest, a marker of the owner's wealth, discernment and taste. Such visibility could be both protective and dangerous. While she was prized and valued, she was also under constant scrutiny, with her behavior, appearance and skill carefully observed and judged. The social pressure created by this attention shaped her daily life interactions and the expectations placed upon her. The attention paid to her extraordinary price also fueled speculation about her abilities, character and origin. Rumors suggested that she was unusually intelligent, exceptionally skilled in domestic arts, or possibly connected to prominent families in some hidden or scandalous way. These stories, whether accurate or fabricated, enhanced her mystique and reinforced the perception of scarcity and uniqueness. Buyers, neighbors, and even other enslaved people were drawn into these narratives, creating a network of perception and gossip that elevated her status while simultaneously reinforcing the social hierarchies that underpinned slavery. The interplay of rumor and reality illustrates how perception could influence value, control behavior and shape human interactions in a system built on commodification. Her exceptional value also highlighted the gendered dynamics of slavery. Female slaves were often assessed not only for labor but for appearance, demeanor, and domestic skills. Her light skin, beauty, intelligence, and poise contributed to the extraordinary price she commanded and reinforced the social and economic frameworks that prioritized certain traits in women over others. The public's fascination with her reflects broader societal obsessions with controlling and defining women's value based on physical and behavioral traits, a dynamic that intersected with the brutal realities of enslavement. Her story became emblematic of these intersecting pressures, illustrating both the exploitation and the symbolic power assigned to female slaves in elite households. The cultural memory of her sale was reinforced by newspapers, letters, and later historical accounts, which often referenced the auction as a benchmark of extremity in the slave trade. Her price was cited as evidence of the extremes to which buyers would go to secure what they perceived as exceptional human property. Over time, her story became a lens through which historians, writers, and social commentators explored issues of value, race, gender, and social hierarchy in the antebellum South. The fascination persisted because her life exemplified both the human cost of commodification and the ways in which wealth and status could distort perceptions of worth. Her presence in the household following the auction was closely tied to the social performance expected of high-value domestic slave. She was expected to navigate the expectations of her owners, the scrutiny of visiting guests, and the complex social dynamics of other enslaved individuals in the household. Her labor was inseparable from the demonstration of social status, requiring not only competence, but also an awareness of perception and image. Each task, each interaction, each display of composure or skill reinforced her symbolic and practical value. The public fascination with her auction ensured that these expectations were amplified, as her performance reflected not only her abilities but also the wisdom and prestige of her owner's purchase. The psychological pressures created by her extraordinary price and public attention were significant. Living under constant observation with the knowledge that her value had been quantified in an unprecedented way required both resilience and adaptability. She needed to manage the expectations of multiple audiences, her owners, household members, visitors, and the broader social network aware of her sale. This environment demanded careful self-presentation, strategic decision-making, and emotional intelligence, all while performing the labor expected of her. The combination of labor, social visibility, and the pressures of being prized yet constrained created a unique and intense lived experience. Her story also illuminates the broader economic structures of the slave trade. The auction demonstrated the ways in which scarcity, perceived skill, and appearance could dramatically inflate price, highlighting the intersection of market forces and social perception. Buyers were influenced not only by practical utility but by speculation, rumor, and the desire for social prestige. The public fascination with her sale underscores the performative aspect of the marketplace, where human lives were evaluated in financial, aesthetic, and symbolic terms. Her extraordinary price provides insight into how value was constructed, contested, and displayed within the antebellum slave economy. Historical accounts suggest that the attention surrounding her sale had lasting effects on both her household and the broader community. Owners may have leveraged her status to signal wealth and discernment, while neighbors and peers engaged in discussions that blended admiration, envy, and moral reflection. Her exceptional value and the impossible secret associated with her story created a lasting narrative that extended beyond the immediate transaction, influencing social dynamics, household hierarchies, and community perception. The fascination with her life illustrates the ways in which extraordinary cases could shape cultural memory and social discourse. The public's interest in her auction also contributed to a form of mythology around her life. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: her beauty, her skills, her mysterious past,
or the record-setting price she commanded. Over time, these elements coalesced into a narrative that transcended the specifics of the transaction, creating a legendary figure whose story exemplified both the extremes of the slave trade and the social dynamics of antebellum Virginia. This mythology, while rooted in historical events, also reflects the ways in which human lives were transformed into symbols, stories and objects of fascination within a society structured by inequality and exploitation. Her case underscores the ways in which extraordinary value could both elevate and endanger enslaved women. While she was prized and highly visible, her exceptional status increased scrutiny, potential for exploitation, and social pressure. Navigating this environment required intelligence, adaptability and careful management of relationships and behavior. The public fascination with her story amplified these dynamics, making her a focal point, not only of household labor but of social observation and narrative construction. Her life illustrates the complex interplay between personal experience, market valuation, and cultural perception in the antebellum South. The legacy of her story extends beyond the immediate context of her auction and household placement. For historians and social commentators, her life provides insight into the ways in which human value was constructed, contested, and displayed in a system built on slavery. The fascination with her price, her rumored past, and the social implications of her presence reflects broader themes of exploitation, gender, race, and social hierarchy. Her story endures because it encapsulates both the extremity of individual experience and the systemic forces that shaped lives in ways that were simultaneously visible, calculated, and deeply oppressive. The extraordinary price paid for the female slave in Virginia not only captured public attention at the time, but also cast a long shadow over her subsequent life, shaping how she was perceived, treated, and remembered in ways that were both public and intensely personal. Her status, as the most expensive female slave ever auctioned, placed her at the intersection of fascination, scrutiny, and exploitation, creating a reality in which her every action carried amplified consequence. From the moment she left the auction block, she entered a world in which labor, appearance, behavior, and perception were inseparably intertwined, where her extraordinary valuation translated into heightened expectations, visibility, and pressures that few other enslaved individuals experienced. In her new household, the responsibilities assigned to her reflected the extraordinary investment her owner had made. Domestic labor was demanding and multifaceted, encompassing cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, and management of household routine. Yet in her case, these tasks were inseparable from the social symbolism of her price. Each action she performed was scrutinized not merely for competence, but for how it reflected on the household, the investment made in her, and her ability to embody refinement and propriety. She was expected to move seamlessly through her duties, demonstrating skill, discretion, and grace at all times, a demand intensified by the awareness of her exceptional auction price and the rumors of her possible lineage, intelligence, or unique quality. Her relationships within the household were complicated by both her status and the dynamics among enslaved people. Other domestic workers, fully aware of the attention her purchase had attracted, may have reacted with jealousy, admiration, or suspicion. Some may have attempted to forge alliances, seeking guidance or protection, while others might have seen her as a rival or as someone under heightened scrutiny. Navigating these interpersonal dynamics required intelligence, social acumen, and careful negotiation, as her interactions could influence both her workload and her social position. The social hierarchy within the household was often fluid yet rigidly enforced, and her exceptional value placed her in a particularly complex position within that structure. High-value domestic slaves were often subject to coercion and exploitation beyond ordinary labor demands. Their owners could claim not only authority over their work, but also over their movements, privacy, and even personal relations. For women, this vulnerability frequently extended to the threat of sexual exploitation or manipulation. The fascination with her extraordinary value may have intensified these risks, as her owners and perhaps others in the household perceived her as a prized possession, whose control required vigilance, attention, and dominance. The constant balancing act between compliance, self-preservation, and subtle assertion of autonomy became a central feature of her daily life. Her post-auction experience also illuminates the broader economic and social mechanisms of slavery. The internal slave trade, particularly in the Upper South, created a market where perceived scarcity, skill, and appearance could dramatically influence price. Her sale exemplified how social perception, rumor, and market forces interacted to create extraordinary valuation. Buyers responded not only to tangible skills, but also to the intangible qualities attributed to her, from poise and beauty to rumored intelligence or unusual lineage. These factors, amplified by the public spectacle of the auction, elevated her status while simultaneously reinforcing the transactional nature of her existence, reminding all parties that her worth was determined externally and quantified monetarily. Her life after the sale required adaptation to the rigorous routines and standards of her new household. While her auction description emphasized domestic competence, the realities of working in a wealthy household demanded ongoing learning and adjustment. Cooking techniques, cleaning methods, clothing care and child management all had household-specific requirements, necessitating both physical skill and mental acuity. She needed to absorb instructions quickly, anticipate expectations, and perform flawlessly under observation. The extraordinary attention surrounding her purchase made errors more consequential, while excellence could reinforce her perceived value and secure a slightly more stable environment within the constraints of enslavement. The broader community also played a role in shaping her experience. Neighbors, visitors, and acquaintances of her owner were often aware of the high price paid for her and the rumors surrounding her past. This visibility created social pressures that went beyond household labor, extending into reputation, social performance, and public perception. Each interaction, each observed behavior became part of a larger narrative about value, status, and propriety. Her existence was thus both private and public, simultaneously constrained by labor expectations, and scrutinized as a symbol of wealth and discernment. The psychological effects of this scrutiny were profound. Living under the awareness that one's value had been quantified in an extraordinary way, while being constantly observed and evaluated, created a pressure cooker environment. She had to manage the expectations of her owners, the judgments of other household members, the perceptions of the community, and the internal challenge of maintaining personal composure and dignity under extreme constraints. Emotional resilience, self-awareness, and strategic social navigation were not optional. They were necessary tools for survival in an environment where one misstep could have severe consequences. Her position also underscores the intersection of gender and labor within slavery. While male slaves' value was often assessed in terms of physical strength and productivity, female slaves were evaluated through a combination of labor capability, appearance, demeanor, and social adaptability. Her light skin, beauty, intelligence, and poise contributed directly to her valuation and influenced how she was treated within and outside the household. The public fascination with her extraordinary auction price highlights the ways in which enslaved women's bodies and behavior were scrutinized, commodified, and leveraged for social and economic gain, reflecting the gendered and racialized hierarchies that structured the antebellum. Rumors about her past continued to influence her treatment and social perception. Speculation about unusual lineage, hidden skills, or connections to prominent families reinforced her mystique and affected expectations placed upon her. Owners may have interpreted these rumors as signs of exceptional capacity, increasing the demands on her labor and behavior. Other enslaved people may have viewed her through the lens of these stories, influencing social dynamics, alliances, and tensions within the household. The interplay between perception, rumor, and reality illustrates the extent to which her life was shaped by narratives external to her control, narratives that both elevated her status and intensified the pressures she faced. Her extraordinary price also placed her within the broader historical memory of slavery in Virginia and the United States. Her sale became emblematic of the extremes of human commodification, the ways in which market forces intersected with appearance, skill, and rumor, and the gendered and racialized nature of valuation. Historians, writers, and social commentators have cited her story to illustrate not only economic dynamics but also the human consequences of slavery, the pressures faced by high-value domestic slaves, and the enduring fascination with lives that were simultaneously invisible and hyper-visible within oppressive systems. The long-term consequences of her auction and placement in a household underscore both vulnerability and influence. While she was at heightened risk of exploitation due to her value, her skills, composure, and intelligence may have afforded her slightly greater leverage or protection in navigating daily life. Her visibility made her a central figure within her household and community, and her actions, demeanor, and ability to perform under scrutiny could influence perceptions, social interactions, and even the treatment of other enslaved people. She became both an instrument of her owner's status and a participant, albeit constrained in the complex social fabric surrounding her, demonstrating the intertwined nature of labor, social signaling, and personal agency under slavery. Ultimately, her life after the auction illustrates the enduring impact of extraordinary valuation on daily existence. The pressures of labor, visibility, scrutiny, and social negotiation created an environment in which every action had consequences beyond the immediate task. She navigated expectations imposed by her owners, the household, and the broader social network, balancing compliance, discretion, and self-preservation in a context defined by commodification, racial hierarchy, and gendered expectation. Her story exemplifies how extraordinary value, rumor, and public fascination could shape the lived experience of enslaved individuals, creating a reality in which labor, perception, and survival were inseparably intertwined. The story of the most expensive female slave ever auctioned in Virginia took on an almost legendary quality, shaped not only by the extraordinary price paid for her but by the rumors, speculation, and fascination that surrounded her both during and after the sale. Her life became a lens through which contemporaries and later historians could examine the intersections of labor, gender, race, and social perception in the antebellum South. Each detail, real or imagined, contributed to a narrative that blurred the lines between fact and legend, turning her into a figure whose extraordinary valuation at auction elevated her presence far beyond the typical experience of enslaved women in Virginia. Following the auction, her daily existence was shaped by expectations that were both practical and symbolic. Her labor within the household encompassed cooking, cleaning, managing laundry, and attending to children, yet her extraordinary value meant that these tasks carried additional significance. She was expected to perform flawlessly, as each action reflected not only on her skills but also on the judgment and prestige of her owner. The awareness of her record-breaking price likely influenced the way tasks were assigned, the level of scrutiny she received, and the behaviors deemed acceptable. The extraordinary circumstances of her purchase created a situation in which ordinary domestic duties were amplified into performances of competence, decorum, and social representation. Her interactions with other enslaved individuals in the household were equally complex. Enslaved people often formed networks of mutual support, sharing knowledge, coping strategies, and solidarity in navigating the pressures of servitude. Yet her elevated status, combined with the notoriety of her price, may have complicated these relationships. Some peers could have viewed her as favored, while others might have been suspicious or envious, interpreting her exceptional position as a potential source of tension. Negotiating these social dynamics required intelligence, discretion, and strategic engagement, as alliances and rivalries could influence both her workload and her day-to-day safety. Her value placed her in a liminal space, simultaneously part of the enslaved community and set apart by external perception and economic investment. The visibility of her extraordinary value extended beyond the household to the broader community. Neighbors, acquaintances, and other members of the social milieu were likely aware of the record-setting auction, contributing to a sense of public scrutiny. Her behavior, appearance, and labor became subjects of observation and speculation, amplifying the pressures she faced. In addition to performing her duties, she had to navigate the social expectations created by her notoriety, balancing compliance with personal preservation. The intersection of public fascination and private labor created a unique psychological environment, in which her every action carried amplified consequences. The extraordinary price she commanded also placed her at heightened risk of exploitation. High-value female slaves were often subject to coercion, including sexualized attention and psychological manipulation, as their owners sought to assert control over both labor and personal autonomy. Her visibility and rarity intensified these vulnerabilities, making discretion, self-protection, and strategic behavior critical to survival. The tension between being prized and being constrained was a defining feature of her post-auction experience, requiring intelligence, emotional resilience, and adaptability. Her ability to navigate these pressures speaks to both her personal capacities and the broader realities of enslaved women in elite households. Her story also illuminates the gendered dimensions of labor and valuation in slavery. Female slaves were assessed not only for physical capability and skill, but also for appearance, demeanor, and social adaptability. Her light skin, beauty, and composure contributed directly to the extraordinary price she commanded, reflecting societal preoccupations with race, gender, and perceived refinement. The public fascination with her auction underscores how these traits were leveraged within the system of slavery, shaping both her treatment and the expectations imposed upon her. Her life exemplifies how commodification intersected with gendered and racialized hierarchies, producing experiences that were simultaneously exceptional and deeply constrained. The rumors and speculations surrounding her past further influenced her treatment and social perception. Stories suggesting unusual lineage, hidden talents, or connections to prominent families amplified her mystique and reinforced the perception of scarcity and uniqueness. Owners may have interpreted these rumors as indicators of exceptional ability, increasing the expectations placed upon her labor and behavior. Other enslaved individuals may have reacted to these narratives, shaping household dynamics, alliances, and tension. The interplay between rumor, perception, and reality highlights the ways in which social narratives could materially affect an individual's experience, even when grounded in speculation rather than fact. Her extraordinary value and the attention it generated had implications for her legacy. Historical records, memoirs and later analyses frequently reference her auction as an extreme example of human commodification, emphasizing both the price and the fascination surrounding her. These accounts underscore the ways in which economic valuation, social perception, and rumor intersected to create a narrative that transcended the specifics of her labor. Over time, her story became emblematic of the extremes of the domestic slave trade, offering insights into the psychological, social and economic dimensions of slavery for women whose lives were shaped by both practical labor demands and symbolic expectation. The daily realities of her post-auction life were shaped by the interplay of labor, visibility and survival. She had to perform her domestic duties under constant observation, while also managing the social dynamics of the household and community. Each task carried significance beyond its practical function, as it reflected on her skill, behavior and compliance. The extraordinary price paid for her elevated every action into a performance, where success reinforced perceived value and missteps risked punishment or social censure. Her capacity to navigate these pressures demonstrates both the resilience required of enslaved women, and the ways in which extraordinary circumstances magnified ordinary demands. Her story also reflects the broader economic mechanisms of the antebellum. The internal slave trade placed a premium on perceived scarcity, skill, and appearance, and her auction exemplified how these factors could interact to produce record-breaking price. Buyers evaluated her not solely for labor but also for the intangible qualities attributed to her, from composure and intelligence to rumors of lineage or uniqueness. This case illustrates how market forces, social narratives, and human perception converge to shape the value of individual lives within the institution of slavery. Her extraordinary price was thus both a personal marker and a reflection of broader systemic dynamics. The visibility and fascination surrounding her also influenced her social positioning within the household. High-value domestic slaves were often expected to embody refinement, discretion and loyalty, serving as both workers and symbols of status. Her performance, appearance, and interactions were closely monitored, amplifying the psychological and emotional pressures of servitude. She had to navigate the competing demands of owners, other enslaved individuals and public perception, balancing compliance, self-preservation and subtle assertion of agency. The extraordinary attention surrounding her auction made these negotiations both more critical and more complex, highlighting
Ultimately, her life after the auction illustrates the enduring consequences of extraordinary valuation in a system predicated on commodification. The pressures of labor, observation, and social expectation created a reality in which survival required constant adaptation, intelligence, and emotional resilience. Her story exemplifies how rumor, perception, and extraordinary circumstances could shape lived experience, elevating an individual into visibility while simultaneously constraining autonomy. Her narrative endures not only as a historical case but as a symbol of the ways in which value, gender, race, and social dynamics converge to define the lives of enslaved women in antebellum Virginia. The extraordinary story of the most expensive female slave ever auctioned in Virginia culminates in an examination of the long-term consequences of her sale, both for her own life and for the household and community that surrounded her. The repercussions of such a high-profile transaction extended beyond the immediate labor she performed, shaping social dynamics, perceptions, and personal experiences in ways that were profound, complex, and often invisible to outsiders. After the auction, her life was a careful negotiation of visibility, labor, and survival, where each action carried implications not only for her own safety and standing but also for the symbolic value she represented to her owners and the broader society. Upon entering her new household, she faced a combination of opportunity and danger. The extraordinary price paid for her placed her in a position of both privilege and heightened vulnerability. On the one hand, she was likely given tasks and living conditions that reflected her value with a level of care and attention not always afforded to other enslaved individuals. On the other hand, this very value made her a constant focus of scrutiny. Her behavior, appearance, and productivity were closely observed by her owners, visiting acquaintances, and other members of the household, creating an environment in which missteps could carry consequences far beyond ordinary domestic labor. Each day required vigilance, adaptability, and a careful balance between compliance and subtle assertion of agency. Her labor responsibilities were multifaceted and demanding. As a domestic servant, she was expected to perform cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, and household management with precision and grace. However, the extraordinary attention attached to her value meant that her labor was more than practical. It was performative. She had to embody refinement, competence, and discretion at all times, demonstrating qualities that validated the significant investment made in her. The pressure to maintain this level of performance would have been intense, as any lapse could reflect negatively not only on her personal reputation but also on the social standing of her owners. This dual function of labor as practical service and as a marker of status created a unique set of pressures that shaped her daily existence. Interactions with other enslaved individuals were similarly influenced by her high-profile status. While domestic slaves often formed supportive networks, her extraordinary value may have created tension, jealousy, or suspicion among peers. Some may have sought alliances, admiration, or mentorship, while others might have viewed her as a rival or as someone whose visibility could bring additional scrutiny to the household. Navigating these relationships required social intelligence, careful observation, and strategic decision-making. Her position placed her in a liminal space, simultaneously part of the enslaved community yet set apart by economic valuation and public fascination. Managing these dynamics was a continuous, delicate process, impacting not only her day-to-day interactions but also her overall well-being and sense of agency. The psychological pressures stemming from her extraordinary valuation were considerable. Living under constant observation with the knowledge that her worth had been quantified at an unprecedented level created a pervasive environment of stress and vigilance. She needed to manage the expectations of her owners, the perceptions of household members, and the judgments of the broader social network aware of her auction. Emotional resilience and adaptability were essential, as failure to navigate these pressures could result in punishment, social isolation, or other forms of exploitation. Her ability to maintain composure and fulfill her duties in this context illustrates both her personal fortitude and the broader challenges faced by high-value domestic slaves in elite households. The gendered nature of her experience is particularly significant. Female slaves were often assessed not only for their labor capabilities but also for appearance, demeanor, and the capacity to uphold social expectations within the household. Her light skin, intelligence, beauty, and composure directly contributed to her extraordinary auction price, reinforcing societal preoccupations with racialized and gendered hierarchies. These qualities shaped both her treatment and the expectations placed upon her, highlighting the intersection of commodification and gendered valuation. The fascination surrounding her life reflects broader societal patterns in which women's bodies, behavior, and perceived refinement were leveraged as measures of wealth, taste, and social authority. Rumors about her past, lineage, and abilities continued to influence how she was perceived and treated. Stories suggesting rare intelligence, unusual heritage, or connections to prominent families amplified her mystique and reinforced the perception of scarcity. These narratives, whether true or exaggerated, shaped expectations placed upon her, influenced relationships with peers and owners, and contributed to a social environment in which perception could significantly impact treatment and opportunity. Her life illustrates how rumor and speculation could extend beyond the auction block, affecting daily experiences and social positioning in ways that were both subtle and profound. Her extraordinary valuation had implications for the broader community as well. Neighbors, acquaintances, and social observers were aware of her status, and her presence within the household served as a tangible symbol of her owner's wealth, discernment, and social standing. This visibility reinforced social hierarchies, signaling not only economic power but also the capacity to secure and manage an individual of perceived exceptional value. Her daily actions, demeanor, and labor were therefore subject to observation not only within the household but also within the wider social network, amplifying both the pressures she faced and the symbolic weight of her existence. The performance of labor in her post-auction life cannot be separated from its symbolic dimensions. Cooking, cleaning, and childcare were not simply practical tasks, but also demonstrations of refinement, discipline, and social propriety. Success validated her extraordinary price and reinforced the prestige of her owners, while mistakes or perceived shortcomings could jeopardize both her position and the household's reputation. This dual nature of labor as both practical and symbolic created an environment in which ordinary domestic duties carried extraordinary consequences, requiring skill, composure, and constant awareness. Her story also reflects the economic mechanisms of slavery in Virginia. The record-setting price paid for her illustrates how scarcity, appearance, skill, and rumor could converge to inflate value. Buyers considered not only practical utility but also intangible qualities, such as comportment, perceived intelligence, and aesthetic appeal. The extraordinary auction demonstrates how social perception, market forces, and speculation intersected to shape the valuation of human lives, creating experiences in which individuals were simultaneously commodities, symbols, and labor. Her post-sale life was therefore shaped by both the economic calculations of her owner and the broader social narratives that surrounded her. The long-term impact of her extraordinary valuation extended to the psychological and social dimensions of her daily life. Living in a household where her every action was scrutinized, she had to balance compliance with subtle assertion of agency,
ensuring survival while maintaining dignity. Relationships with other enslaved individuals, interactions with household members, and management of public perception were all influenced by her notoriety and value. Each day required strategic navigation of social, labor, and emotional dynamics, underscoring the complexity of life for high-value female slaves and the ways in which extraordinary circumstances magnified ordinary pressure. Her story ultimately demonstrates the enduring consequences of commodification and social fascination. The auction created a life in which labor, visibility, and personal survival were inseparably linked, and where extraordinary value imposed both advantages and vulnerability. The pressures of performance, observation, and social expectation defined her experience, while rumor and public perception amplified the stakes of daily life. Her life serves as a powerful illustration of how extraordinary valuation, gendered expectations, and social dynamics intersected within slavery, shaping experiences that were simultaneously highly visible, intensely scrutinized, and profoundly constructed. The story of the most expensive female slave ever auctioned in Virginia is more than a tale of extraordinary price. It is a stark reflection of the brutal realities of slavery, the commodification of human lives, and the intricate social, economic, and psychological pressures placed upon those who were enslaved. Her life from the auction block to the household illustrates how value was measured not only in labor but in appearance, rumor, and perceived rarity, creating a world in which survival demanded intelligence, resilience, and constant vigilance. She existed at the intersection of fascination and exploitation, visibility and vulnerability, a living symbol of both human ambition and human cruelty. Her story endures because it exposes the impossible contradictions of a society that celebrated wealth and refinement, while denying basic humanity. It forces us to confront the ways in which status, gender, race, and perception were weaponized, how social narratives could define lives, and how the extraordinary could coexist with oppression. The pressures she faced, performing flawlessly under scrutiny, navigating relationships with owners and peers, and managing the ever-present threat of exploitation, remind us that behind every statistic, price tag, or auction notice was a real person whose intelligence, composure, and resilience were tested daily. In remembering her, we recognize the profound human cost behind the numbers and the headlines. Her life challenges us to understand history not merely as transactions or records but as lived experience, as a complex web of struggle, adaptation, and she became more than property. She became a symbol of survival under impossible circumstances, a testament to human resilience in the face of dehumanization. The impossible secret that surrounded her, her rumored abilities, her mysterious past, her extraordinary value serves as a reminder that even in conditions designed to strip agency, the human spirit can endure, resist, and leave a lasting imprint on history. Ultimately, her story stands as both a cautionary tale and a tribute. It cautions us about the depths of cruelty and the distortions of value when humanity is commodified, while it honors the quiet strength and resilience required to navigate a world that measured worth in dollars, appearances, and rumor rather than dignity and life. The legacy of the most expensive female slave ever auctioned in Virginia is a reminder that history's most extraordinary stories are often